Back in 1936, the development of the Fiat G.50 prototype marked an interesting stage in the history of this Italian company. For a long time, Fiat relied on the ideas of their chief designer Celestino Rosatelli, but the arrival of the G.50 was the debut for a new creator, a young engineer named Giuseppe Gabrielli. Although Rosatelli's machines had already evolved from biplanes to all-metal monoplanes like the BR-20 bomber, turning to Gabrielli showed that the company was changing its priorities in design and production. Appearing at the same time as the legendary Hurricane, Spitfire, and Bf-109, the Italian Fiat G.50 did not have such advanced characteristics or much potential for future upgrades. However, at the time of its appearance, the G.50 was the best and most modern fighter in Italy. This aircraft, which received the name Freccia, or Arrow, effectively became the first all-metal monoplane with retractable landing gear and a constant-speed propeller in service with the Italian Air Force. The G.50 was created based on the 1936 requirements for an interceptor fighter. These same requirements also gave life to the excellent Machi C-200, as well as the less successful models like the Caproni F5, the Rho-51, and AUT-18, which never went into mass production. Assembly of the prototype began in 1936, and the first flight took place on 26 February 1937. Since this was the first aircraft constructed to the new Air Force standards, it was subjected to an intensified testing program. The Fiat G.50 turned out to be very easy to handle and exceptionally maneuverable for a monoplane. However, it had two serious flaws: a weak and bulky radial engine with 840 horsepower and weak firepower consisting of only two 50-caliber machine guns. Despite this, the test results satisfied the customers, and in the summer of 1937, the first order for 45 aircraft was received. The novelty was officially presented to the public in October 1937 at the International Aviation Exhibition in Milan. Serial production of the G.50 was kicked off by a subsidiary company. This firm was founded back in 1922, and by 1929, it effectively became a division of the auto giant Fiat. Before that, the facility only handled the licensed assembly of Dornier aircraft, like the WWII, WF, and the WAL, as well as modifying base Fiat models, such as the floatplane ICR-20 and the wheeled CR Asso. But eventually, the engineers shifted to creating their own machinery. Among their designs were the flying boats MF-4, MF-5, and MF-10, as well as the excellent floatplane reconnaissance aircraft, the RS-14, which entered service in 1938 and proved its effectiveness during World War II. Deliveries of the first G.50 series also started in 1938. To test out the new hardware, 12 planes from this batch were specially shipped to Spain for trials in real combat conditions. The G.50 fighters arrived on site in January 1939. That was already way too late for the pilots to get any real experience under enemy fire. No combat losses were recorded, although by the end of the Spanish Civil War, only 11 machines remained operational. That turned out to be insufficient data for serious conclusions, so nothing was ever done to upgrade the armament. At the end of the war, these planes joined an experimental fighter group based in Escalona. Later on, they were handed over to Spanish pilots, and these machines continued flying in the skies over Morocco for some time. Even though the results from the trials in Spain were pretty mixed, an order came in for another 200 G.50 fighters. In the meantime, the so-called Program R set a new course for the Italian Air Ministry. They needed to improve their air forces, both in terms of quantity and quality. Aside from rearming 3 Stormos with the new MC-200 aircraft, the plan called for forming 1 Stormo and 1 group on G.50 fighters. To give you an idea of the scale, an Italian Stormo roughly corresponded to a wing in the Royal Air Force or a group in the U.S. Army Air Forces. It consisted of 2 groups, each of which included anywhere from 2 to 4 squadrons with 3 flights in each. Usually, 3 of these Stormos were combined into a division. The Machi C-200 proved to be significantly better than the G.50, but shutting down production of the latter was not considered a smart move. Even though switching exclusively to the MC-200 would have offered the benefits of standardization, it would have rendered all the production tooling for the G.50 useless. On top of that, at least 6 months would have been lost while the Fiat plant geared up to produce its competitor's model. Making the situation even more complicated was the fact that, in reality, neither the G.50 nor the MC-200 was entirely satisfactory for combat service. Nevertheless, they decided to keep producing the G.50. It was a sort of insurance policy in case of any unforeseen problems with the Machi project. The Fiat G.50 remained in service with Italian aviation until 1948. It fought on many fronts, and some machines even served in the air forces of other nations, delivering respectable results everywhere they went. Although this aircraft didn't become widely famous and often went up against hardware with better specs, the G.50 was a simple and obedient machine. It was this very plane that marked the introduction of new concepts and technical ideas into the design and manufacturing of Italian aviation. In November 1939, G.50 fighters arrived at the squadrons of the 51st Air Regiment, which was going through its formation stage right at that time. The pilots immediately started working on their tactics in war games and training exercises. By the way, that's exactly how the unit got its famous emblem, a black cat catching a green mouse. Here's the story. The old CR-32 biplane fighters often couldn't keep up with the SM-79 bombers from the 12th Regiment, known as the Green Mice. But the new G.50s handled that job without breaking a sweat. So the fighter pilots came up with a symbol that summed up the situation perfectly. 51st Regiment used that emblem throughout the entire war, and it even stuck around with the 51st Air Brigade well after World War II. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, they had 118 Fiat G.50 aircraft in service. Out of those, 97 were with combat units, while another 21 birds were either waiting for delivery or undergoing repairs. These fighters were based near Rome at Ciampino Sud, and partly in Tuscany, where they served alongside the older CR-32s. In the early days of the war, the G.50 wasn't used all that much. Mostly, they were flying cover for SM-79 bombers during raids on the ports and airfields of Corsica. Flight schools were in desperate need of a two-seat version of the G.50, so cadets could get the hang of this machine. The subsidiary company took on the job of developing it. The new model was designated the G.50B, and it took to the skies for the first time on 30 April 1940. The engineers took a standard single-seat fighter as a base, stripped out the weaponry, and added a second cockpit with dual controls. The front cockpit got an enclosed canopy, and the rear cockpit was enclosed too. Production kicked off immediately, and in total, they turned out 108 of these aircraft. Most of these trainers ended up in Italian fighter pilot schools. Only one aircraft survived the war, and it served reliably all the way until 1948 at the school in Lecce. They used it as a transition trainer before moving pilots up to the more powerful MC-205 or the Spitfire. The two-seater machine had a top speed of 283 miles per hour, a takeoff weight of 5,291 pounds, and a payload of 882 pounds. The G.50B model became a big success. Its flight characteristics were nearly identical to the combat aircraft, which ensured the cadets received realistic training. The arrival of this machine eliminated serious training issues that were common in the air forces of many nations at the time. Driven by political ambitions and a desire to boost national prestige, in the autumn of 1940, the Italian government sent a small aviation unit to participate in the German offensive against England. It is worth noting that the main staff of the Italian Air Force was against this decision. They would have preferred to use their available forces on other fronts where they would have been much more useful. In the end, the Italian contribution to the Battle of Britain turned out to be a failure. The main reasons for the failure were the difficult weather conditions, the unsuitability of the aircraft themselves for the assigned tasks, and gaps in personnel training. Aside from the BR-20 bombers, significant fighter forces were stationed at the base in Belgium, located in Belgium. Their composition included 50 CR-42 biplanes and 48 G.50 fighters. The first combat sortie involving the G.50 took place on October 29, 1940. They provided cover for bombers during an attack on Ramsgate. A similar mission was planned against Great Yarmouth on November 11th, but the weather prevented it. From the middle of November 1940 to the end of January 1941, Italian pilots quite actively patrolled the sky over the English Channel and along the coasts of Belgium and Holland. However, no combat encounters with enemy fighters were recorded. By January 31, 1941, the majority of the Expeditionary Corps units had returned to Italy. However, two squadrons, the 352nd and the 353rd, remained in the region until April 15, 1941. Initially, they were based in Maldegem and later in Davray, continuing to patrol the zone between Dunkirk and Calais. The Fiat G.50 achieved significant, even if lesser-known, success with foreign air forces, especially with the Finns. The Finnish government ordered 35 of these aircraft at the end of 1939, right before the outbreak of the Winter War. During trials at the experimental center in Guidonia, the acceptance pilot, Lieutenant Tapani Harmaja, pulled off something pretty impressive. On 14th of November 1939, he pushed the plane into a dive, hitting 515 miles per hour. The machine handled the stress with almost no damage except for the cockpit canopy, which was completely shattered. However, the German authorities decided to hold up the delivery of this hardware to the Finns. The first batch of 14 aircraft didn't arrive until February 1940, and another 12 were delivered in March. They started replacing the old Gladiator fighters in Squadron 26 right away, but the unit never got the chance to enter combat before the armistice was signed in March. At first, the Fiat G.50s sported a dull olive camouflage on the top and sides, while the undersides were painted light gray. The tail numbers, ranging from FA1 to FA35, were painted on the tail section of the fuselage and under the wings. Before the start of the so-called Continuation War, which kicked off in June 1941, the planes got a new paint job. Now they wore black and green camouflage on top, and the belly became blue. From then on, the numbers were painted exclusively on the sides of the fuselage. Squadron HLELV-26 was originally based at Uti and saw plenty of action near Lake Ladoga. The G.50 fighter stayed on the front lines until May 1944. However, these planes just weren't built for operating in severe freezing weather, which caused major headaches for the mechanics during maintenance. The pilots also complained about the weak firepower from the 2 machine guns and the short flight range. Before the G.50s were swapped out for the Brewster B-239 and transferred to training units, these machines managed to rack up some successes. 8 Finnish aces flew them, not counting the 2 most famous ones. Oiva Tuominen, who scored 43 victories during the entire war, and Olli Puhakka. It was actually in the G.50 that they claimed the majority of their victories. Master pilot Oiva Tuominen received the country's highest honor, the Mannerheim Cross. This happened following a battle on August 17, 1941, when, flying his G.50, he shot down 4 Soviet bombers in just 4 minutes. The pilot was forced to break off his attack only because he ran out of ammunition. By the way, not many people know that Italian volunteers also fought in Finland against the Soviet Union. One of them, Sergeant Diego Manzocchi, was killed in action. At the start of the Greek campaign in October 1940, 3 air groups equipped with G.50 fighters were allocated for operations in the Balkans. They were stationed at airfields in Albania and southern Italy. That is a total of 43 machines on Albanian soil and 33 in Italy. Despite heroic resistance, the Greek Air Force had nearly exhausted all its strength. Only the intervention of the British in November 1940 saved the situation from total disaster. Although the Italian CR-42 outperformed the English Gladiator, pilots flying the newer G.50s understood one thing perfectly. You should not even try to get into a turning fight, a so-called dogfight, one with the British biplanes. It was better to rely on their advantage in speed. G.50 aircraft took part in fierce combat over Greece until February 1941. The fighting was so intense that reports of shot-down planes began to contradict each other completely. Here are 2 striking examples. On February 20th, the Italians claimed that their 22 G.50 fighters shot down 12 enemy machines without suffering a single loss. However, British reports for that same day state that 6 Hurricane aircraft destroyed 4 Italian fighters on their very first sortie. Later, on February 28th, the Italians reported 12 victories. In contrast, British pilots claimed the destruction of as many as 27 enemy aircraft, mostly by the brand new Hurricanes and a Gladiator squadron, and once again without any losses on their side. This does not diminish the bravery and aggressiveness of the pilots on either side, but it does show just how hard it is for historians to find the truth, even despite the honesty of the airmen. It is worth mentioning an interesting fact going back to the Spanish Civil War. Italian pilots, when finding themselves in a disadvantageous position, would often simulate an uncontrolled fall. Their opponents perceived this as the destruction of the aircraft and chalked up a victory on their account, even though the Italian was actually just pulling a clever move to get out of the fight. The first prototype of the improved G.50 bis version took to the sky on 9 September 1940. This model generally resembled the original G.50, but it received an increased fuel supply, new radio equipment, and an armored back for the pilot's seat. Engineers also slightly changed the fuselage profile, refined the cockpit, and installed a rudder of a new design. All in all, the Fiat and subsidiary plants turned out 421 of these aircraft. The majority of them, specifically 344 machines, were assembled at the Fiat plant in Turin, while the remaining 77 were manufactured at the subsidiary facilities. 9 aircraft were handed over to Croatia, though it is doubtful that they managed to take part in any real combat. The main arena for the G.50 bis became Libya. To keep the engines running in desert conditions, special filters had to be installed on the air intakes and radiators to protect against sand. The first machines arrived in Africa at the end of December 1940 as part of the 358 Squadron. Later, it became part of the 2 Group, which was relieved by the 155 Fighter Group as early as January 1941. The G.50 aircraft provided cover for Italian troops during the retreat from Tripolitania, and later supported the new conquest of Cyrenaica. During that period, mechanics converted some of the planes into fighter bombers right there in the field by installing racks for small bombs under the wings. These machines were particularly active in the Sidi Barrani area, where they fought with mixed success against Hurricane and P-40 fighters. When the more advanced Italian MC-200 fighters arrived at the front, and a little later the MC-202, it made it possible to pull the old G.50 bis off the front lines in North Africa. By December 1941, the only unit still flying them in that region was the 12th Fighter Group in Tripoli. The number of G.50 bis aircraft in Libya was constantly fluctuating, from 20 machines in February 1941 to a peak of 80 planes in October, after which only 35 were left by December. Likewise, these planes were relegated to second-line duties and local air defense in other theaters of operation, specifically in Sardinia, Greece, and the Aegean Sea. The last batches of these machines were used as ground attack aircraft in 1943 until they were replaced by the RE-2000. The G.50 bis flew its final combat sorties near Tunisia, as well as against Allied landing ships during the invasion of Sicily just south of Augusta Bay. In an effort to improve the G.50's performance, the subsidiary company experimented with a few prototypes. The first was the G.50 Tur, equipped with a Fiat A76 engine putting out 1,000 horsepower. It took to the skies for the first time on July 17, 1941. However, development of the engine was halted even before the flight, so the project was effectively dead on arrival. Another version, the G.50V, made its first flight on August 25, 1941. This aircraft received a completely new nose section with an inline Daimler-Benz DB601 engine. This experimental machine was the first step toward creating the G.52 model, which only ever existed on blueprints, but ultimately it was replaced by the much more promising G.55. The final development was the 2-seat fighter bomber G.50 bis A, which first took to the sky on October 3, 1942. The wingspan on this model was increased by 4.5 feet. This allowed for the installation of additional 50 caliber machine guns in the wings with an ammunition supply of 250 rounds, as well as mounts for bombs weighing 330 pounds. This modification was being prepared as a carrier-based aircraft for the aircraft carrier Aquila, which was under construction at the time. To handle deck landings, they even installed a special arresting hook in the tail of the plane. However, the armistice put a stop to the Italian aircraft carrier building program, so development of the G.50 bis A model had to be halted. Now let's get into the details of the design of the G.50 itself. This description generally applies to its improved version, the G.50 bis, as well. By the way, a total of 245 original G.50s were produced, along with 421 aircraft of the G.50 bis series and 108 G.50B trainers, not counting the experimental prototypes. The Fiat G.50 is an all-metal, single-seat interceptor. Its heart was the 14-cylinder Fiat A74 RC38 radial engine with a mechanical supercharger. It produced 840 horsepower at an altitude of 12,500 feet. Thrust came from a metal Hamilton Fiat variable pitch propeller that measured almost 10 feet in diameter. The fuselage featured a sturdy, semi-monocoque construction, while the engine mount was welded from robust steel tubing. Large access panels on the sides of the airframe allowed mechanics to easily get to the engine, fuel tanks, and weapons for maintenance. The armament consisted of 2 synchronized 50-caliber Breda Safat machine guns. They were mounted in the upper nose section in front of the cockpit and could fire either single shots or bursts. The ammunition supply carried 150 rounds per gun. For the pilot's comfort, the cockpit seat was fully adjustable for both height and tilt. Only the first 45 aircraft were equipped with an enclosed cockpit. It had heavy canopy framing, but it still provided the pilots with decent rearward visibility. Although the airmen didn't complain openly, they weren't exactly thrilled with the enclosed cockpit either. So in the end, the designers decided to revert to an open configuration, similar to the ones used on the MC-200 and Caproni F5. On the 5th production bird, they tested a few types of open cockpits. Eventually, for the G.50 and 50 biz models, they approved a version with transparent side flaps that folded down. In the headrest behind the pilot's seat, they installed a simple mechanism to open them. The tail section of the fuselage ended in a structural bulkhead and a tubular frame that supported the tail surfaces. The tail wheel was attached to that same bulkhead, complete with a shock absorber to dampen impacts. The aircraft's wing was made up of 3 parts. The center section was welded from steel tubing and attached to the bottom of the fuselage, and the 2 outer wing panels with stressed skin were bolted onto that. The flaps were hydraulically operated. Here's an interesting detail. They would automatically retract once the plane went faster than a specific speed. The ailerons were well balanced and featured a metal frame, but they were fabric covered. At first, the plane used Messier-type main landing gear struts that retracted into the fuselage, but later on they swapped those out for Magnagi struts. The system worked in a pretty interesting way. Hydraulics handled retracting the wheels, but they were extended pneumatically, using compressed air to actuate the mechanisms. To ensure a soft landing, they installed hydraulic shock absorbers inside the telescopic struts. If the extension or retraction system failed, the pilot could operate the landing gear manually, and special indicators in the cockpit showed if everything was okay. The brakes were pneumatic too. They were powered by a small compressor that was also used to start the engine. The maximum fuel capacity was 82 gallons. This fuel was split across 5 containers, 2 wing tanks holding 12 gallons each, 2 main fuselage tanks holding 26 and 18 gallons, plus 1 additional tank holding 13 gallons. The tail wheel didn't retract during flight. It could swivel 45 degrees to either side and had an automatic centering mechanism. At least on the first 45 aircraft, this wheel was fitted with its own hydraulic shock absorber. The tail structure itself was classic, all metal, but with fabric-covered control surfaces. Inside the cockpit, the designers conveniently grouped all the instruments and controls on 3 panels right in front of the pilot's eyes. The upper section was in charge of combat and flight. This is where they placed the San Giorgio sight, navigation, as well as the temperature, fuel, and engine monitoring sensors. The middle panel, among other things, contained the fire warning light, ammunition counter, oxygen controls, landing gear position indicators, and the compass. The bottom panel showed the compressed air pressure and handled the ignition and engine cooling controls. On the left side, right under your hand, sat the throttle lever, fuel mixture settings, and radio buttons. Oil was kept in a single tank with a capacity of 9.6 gallons, which they mounted on the bulkhead in front of the cockpit, while the cooling radiators were built into the leading edge of the wings. The 12-volt electrical system was powered by 2 batteries hidden under the floor, while the ARC-1 radio was installed behind the pilot's back. Also, the G.50 fighter had a built-in fire suppression system and a mount for an OMI FM62 gun camera, which could be installed in the right wing.